Chapter 1. Memory. I guess she's always there, in some way, shape, or form. I swore someone in the city the other day asked me how she was. I didn't even know she was still in my mind. After looking at the same ceiling for 6 months, it was time he got out. His wounds were healing with grace, but something stopped him from leaving the house. Perhaps the comfort of the company of his family and the hospitality they offered their newfound hero kept him. Or the security of the safe haven of his childhood home. It helped him to make some sense out of the past 6 years that seemed to come and go with but a breath. He hadn't decided before today that it was time to move on. Today, he'd deal with it. He'd start to live his life again. But first, he had to face it all. All of the things that put a shadow on his heart. All his regrets, his decisions. All these things that I've let happen have directed my life, Matt thought. Decisions made out of pure anger for all of his time. Was it all to prove myself to someone or something? And if so, what did I prove? In some strange way, what had happened to Matt now seemed like an awakening of sorts. He was able to take the past 6 years of his life and put them up for review. He was able to clearly view the period in his mind's eye. What were my reasons? He thought. This was the question posed time and time again through his endless time he spent in reverie. Joining the World Police Force seemed so out of character to the person he thought he was throughout his youth. Working through all the tortures of boot camp, no matter the pain, he took it without second thought, further stretching his limits. All the pains he brought his body to bear, the nausea and agony, he learned to ignore. When it would come time to wake up in the morning, after little more than 3 hours of sleep, his body begged that he lay back down and walk away from all the pain. Others were doing it. Men would start crying in the middle of the night, like Jeff, his first bunkmate. Matt could never forget. It was 3:30 in the morning when he first heard his friend's sobs. The cries grew louder, uncontrolled. Everyone knew why he cried. He cried because of the ache he was feeling. The ache they all were feeling. Not the physical, the emotional pain of having your identity ripped from you. The emotional pain of being away from your family and friends and going through this crucible. The loneliness of standing on your own. Your only worth being what was useful to the group, the WPF. And the fear and shame that you would not make it. In the World Police Force, you were not permitted an individual identity. Your identity was that of the group, a collective. Only the strong survived. And if you weren't strong, you learned really quickly how to become strong. And if you couldn't learn, you didn't stay. You didn't make it. You were cut. A dishonor visited on many. The World Police Force would settle for nothing less than a unit committed to the cause. Only a trained killer would come out of boot camp. Many of its traditions and purposes derived from the Marines. A human being with the ability to kill for the cause of unifying the world and destroying those who fought against the American dream of global unity and peace. But Jeff wasn't a killer. Jeff wasn't part of a collective. He was his own man, had his own identity. There would be no changing that. It made him refreshingly different from everyone else. But he just didn't belong. His crying grew louder that night. Louder and louder. There was no particular event that triggered Jeff's behavior. It was the fracturing of a young man from an extended period of stress. Part of Matt wanted to reach out to his friend, but his identity reformation had already taken place. Matt's identity was now part of the group. Jeff failed at attaining that identity and got thrown out of camp and the WPF. Matt remembered where that thought first crossed his mind. He heard the cruel, stomping footprints of the sergeant entering the room with a sense of held-back hellfire of rage towards his private on the verge of an emotional breakdown.
"Private Welsh,"
he shouted at Jeff.
"Why is it that you wish your squad to start the day even earlier?"
Jeff knew what he had done. He couldn't contain himself. He sobbed even more wildly as the emotion shrank him to that of a squabbling, helpless child.
"No, sir,"
Welsh said in a sob.
"I'm sorry. Please, no."
Jeff didn't want to be responsible for any punishment of the entire squad. The guilt and the thought of letting his team down was more than he could handle.
"Squad, on your feet!"
shouted the sergeant.
"You've got 30 seconds to be on your feet and running laps around this camp."
With only the sounds of men dressing at a frantic pace, the squad was all on their feet and out the door. The camp was probably 2 miles or more in circumference, and the thought of laps of this magnitude was an exhausting one, Matt remembered. Matt was the third one out of the barracks, with Jeff surprisingly right behind him, trying to keep up with his friend. The squad took off around the camp. The sergeant was running behind them, yelling,
"We will run until the sun comes up, and then we will begin the rest of the day. And we will do this every day until you all start acting like men. If any of you have any problem with this, see Private Welsh."
The sergeant's voice trailed as the squad began their run. Jeff, still sobbing uncontrollably, running behind him.
"Matt,"
he sobbed.
"I'm sorry."
Matt's heart became cold in a way it never had. He simply ignored his friend and began running at a quicker pace. As Matt pulled away, he heard Jeff fall in the mud. He looked over his shoulder. He saw his friend getting kicked by those passing him. Jeff was beat, laying on the ground. He no longer tried to get up and carry on. He had fully given up now. This infuriated Matt. He never saw Jeff again. Matt never guessed in his youth that he would become that kind of friend. He originally justified it. He was helping Jeff learn a valuable lesson. But had he? He was protecting the group from the weak. Some men just don't have a soldier in their heart, Matt thought. He now questioned these thoughts and the actions of a host of other incidents. Had this path he was taking for the past 6 years just been wrong? Had he wasted 6 years in just going the wrong direction? There was no answer that would sit well with him. The only solution that he had come to was that he had to move on. End of story. But still, the past came to the forefront of his memory, and once again, he savored in the intoxicating ability of his memories. Where did this cloud begin? He knew the answer. But he enjoyed the journey backward through his life, his memory. The anticipation filled him. It was like a child trying to sleep before Christmas. This was real. He thought of her. Matt was 16, a sophomore in high school. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. Matt, a loner, but kind of a class clown, if the audience would have it. Friends with everyone and no one. He was never the most popular kid in school, and never the least. He was just okay with everyone. But there was another side to Matt. A side he didn't often show. The side of him that reveled in poetry, art, and music. These, his passions. It was something that he took extremely seriously. At 16, you can't be known for liking poetry. The highly cliquish and judgmental high school hierarchy just didn't socially accept that. But that was a side that he couldn't deny, or at least deny forever. Matt was a romantic. Art to him was passion in its essence. It was the beautiful side of human nature, where we explored our existence. This was the side of him that her beauty aroused. Matt wrote some poetry of his own, and many of his pieces were about her. In between cracking jokes that made the class roll with laughter, he would watch her closely, though it never seemed she paid any attention to him, no matter how many jokes he told. He couldn't seem to get her attention. She simply came to class and left, never uttering a word to anyone. She seemed invisible to most, but not to Matt. All his thoughts were spent on her, and he would act out conversations in his imagination. She would tell him how funny he was. Yes, he could make her laugh out loud, holding her stomach, begging him to stop. "Matt, you are so funny," she would say. The fantasy nearly made him euphoric, but that is all it was, a fantasy. When the reality of this set in, he realized he had to find a way to talk to her. He ran situations and scenarios through his mind, and a solution to virtually every situation his vast imagination could conjure up. But none of them ever came to the plane of reality. This was the weak bond that connected the two, Matt and Stephanie. His imagination. Until one day, he saw his friend sitting at her lunch table. Actually, Joe was more of an acquaintance than a friend. But this was reason enough in the mind of Matthew Blair to be the perfect stratagem to make a new friend and to be close to the girl that his mind obsessed over. "Joe," he said, "you mind if I have a seat?" "No, not at all," he responded. How perfect, he thought as he sat. Not too far away and not too obvious. Stephanie sat next to her friend, Amanda, who seemed like trouble to Matt, but that barely even registered into his consciousness. He became kind of an artificial friend to Joe for the rest of the year, just to be close to her. He never tired of the pointless pseudo-conversation they would have. "I hear the basketball team might go to state this year," Matt would say. "Yeah, maybe. If they would put me on point guard, they would have more of a chance. But I'll see if I can make it happen as forward," said Joe. Obviously overconfident and maybe just a little bit arrogant. Matt had no problem making it, as long as he could see her out of the corner of his eye. One day, after lunch, he was walking down the hall, going over in his head how he was making the whole table roar with laughter, except for her and her friend. Were his jokes not as funny as he thought? Or maybe she didn't have a sense of humor. That's okay, he thought. She makes up for it in her grace. Then, at the end of the hallway, he saw her. She was sitting on one of the benches. "This is your chance," a voice inside screamed at him with a rush of adrenaline. He could feel his heart pounding. "Hey, your name's Stephanie, right?" Matt said, like he didn't already know. "Yeah," she replied, with kind of a defensive, yet vulnerable look on her face. "What's yours?" How could she not know my name? Matt thought, and this thought was crushing to him. Something inside him caused him to want to withdraw. He wished he could just continue his safe walk down the hall, keeping his thoughts of her in the safe containment of his head. He should have never opened the door this slight amount, letting her know he knew she existed. But he did. "My name's Matt," he said after a brief pause, letting the thoughts run the course through his mind. Suddenly, with a look of disapproval and insult on her face, she said, "Oh yeah, the guy who never shuts up." To Matt, this was a challenge, one he had waited many months to take. "Yep, I guess that's me." To Matt, his words to her could be translated to, "Challenge accepted." She responded to him with a look that asked, "Okay, what do you want?" "Well, I was wondering what a girl as beautiful as you would be doing with that sad look on your face that you always seem to have." The words felt clumsy, but Matt backed them up with an air of confidence. He laughed on the inside, seeing her vulnerability in her deep brown eyes. But suddenly, another part of him started running possible outcomes to this comment. She could simply answer, highly unlikely. She could become enraged. That would be destructive to his ego. Or she could answer around the question. Looking back now, the question was stupid, Matt thought. "Well, I'm sorry the look on my face doesn't suit you," she responded with a fire well hidden behind her words. Wow, he thought. That was a combination shot, considering his probabilistic outcomes. "Oh no, your face suits me fine. I just don't think it's just to see such a pretty girl seem so sad," Matt said, wondering where exactly this came from. "I was just checking to see if there was something I could do about that." Her face was stone. He searched for some type of reaction. He searched her olive skin, her brown hair, and her attached earlobes with dangling crosses. Then, the journey of his eyes reached her lips, and he had never seen such perfect, full lips. He had kissed girls before, but always at the dare of his friends, never out of his own desire. The way they were displayed on her face, the way they were shaped, called to him, and from that moment on, he was at her mercy. Matt suddenly lost all confidence and was terrified. He had never gotten this close of a look to realize the full, almost terrible wrath of Stephanie's beauty. With his eyes solely fixed on her lips, they began to open. Had she seen his fixation on her lips? Fear shot through him. "Well, say something," he thought. "Maybe," she stated, in an overly simple way that totally immobilized his unexpectedly blank mind. He couldn't move his eyes from her lips. What if she'd noticed? She had to have noticed by now. "Think, where's my head?" he thought. After what seemed to him an eternity, but was actually about 3 seconds, he answered her. "We should go out to eat," he said. She laughed, sensing his sudden nervousness, and at the appearance of her laughter, he realized that that very laughter was a signal in the achieving of his goal. "Okay. When?" she said to him, surprisingly enough. His thoughts were, again, scattered all over the sudden hollowness of his head. "Friday?" she smiled. He was relieved. "Yeah," she said. "You're going to have to pick me up. I don't have a car." "Oh yeah, I totally will," Matt said in an exasperated tone. "Could I get your number?" "Sure," she said plainly, as she reached for a piece of paper. His eyes still mesmerized by the plague of beauty spreading out from her lips to the furthest reaches of her face and beyond. Then her friend Amanda walked up and looked at him as Stephanie handed him the paper. "Hey," she said to her friend, as he grabbed the paper from her hand. "Did you get it?" Her friend glanced over at Matt with an annoyed and disapproving look. "Yeah," she said, as her look was leaving his, returning to hers. As Matt took the piece of paper, he looked around the hall for something else to focus on instead of butting in on their conversation. He tried not to listen, but got bits and pieces. Apparently, they were buying something from one of the other students or someone at the school. He didn't know, and he didn't care. He just got Stephanie Morris's phone number. At this realization, it was all he could do not to jump up and down. When he realized that the two girls' conversation was going to be longer than he thought, he suddenly butted in and said, "Well, hey, Stephanie, I'll give you a call later." With a slow turn of her head towards him and a devious smile, she answered, "Okay, I'll talk to you later then." That was it. The conversation was over. As he walked away, he could barely keep a lid on his overabundance of glee. He heard her resume her conversation with Amanda. As Matt lay on his bed, his memory sequence ended. A knock came to his bedroom door. "Hey, sweetie," his mother said. "I'm going to bed. Let me know if you need anything." He smiled. Mothers had such a warm way. It was a special kind of love they had for their children. It's a love that existed in no other type of love. Mothers are responsible for showing sons and daughters what love is, how it feels, how to love, and how to be loved. It was a mother's purpose. "Okay, Mom," he replied. "Thanks. Good night, sweetie." "Night," Matt said. Matt turned on the TV. It was late, 11:30. Another day passed with him hardly knowing it was there. It was June 21st, the first day of summer. Matt grunted out loud at the realization of this fact. Nothing on, Matt thought, as his mind returned to his memory. That first date with Stephanie was one that he would always remember and cherish. As soon as she got into his car, her presence was like a loud sound to his sixth sense. They made small talk, and he realized quickly that his confidence was useless in her presence. She made him vulnerable. She could see right through him. He couldn't hide from her deep eyes. They pierced his face as he drove. How she took him seriously in that first piece of junk car, he did not know. But she did. She smiled at him all the time. And he had the constant validation that he was making her smile, that he was helping. His heart's defenses were no match. He was lost to her, even at this early date. By the end of that school year, it was known throughout the school that Matt and Stephanie were an item. Everyone had seen the change in Matt. He was totally gone over this girl that no one seemed to notice until now. By that summer, he was over at Stephanie's house daily. He became acquainted with her family and quite quickly accepted. Matt sensed something off or strange about the family, but never saw fit to mention anything. There were constantly conversations about when Dad gets home, though Matt had never seen him before. Stephanie's mother often changed the subject when it came up. Stephanie seemed to avoid the conversation as well. One day, as they were walking through a flea market in one of the many suburbs of Baltimore, Matt asked her about her father. "Hey, Steph," he asked. "Yeah," she said absently, as she was totally fixated and intrigued on the thing she was looking at. "Where's your dad?" he asked very heavily, concerned. To his surprise, she continued to be engulfed in the pottery, ignoring his inquiry. "This thing is like 500 years old," she whispered to him, lifting a piece of pottery with what looked like hieroglyphics on it. She began again, looking at the pottery, seeming to ignore his questions. He glanced at the Indian woman sitting behind the pottery stand and glanced back at Stephanie. "Hey," he asked, and she turned to him with a glare. "Why won't you answer my question?" She gave him a glare that could kill, as she nonchalantly as possible stormed away. He followed her, and when she heard his footsteps catching up, stopped and turned. She looked at him. "Where my father is none of your business," she growled at him. Matt had no idea what he had done. He continued to follow her. When they were leaving, they both got into the car silently. He was concerned. He ran through his mind, trying to find what he possibly could have done. Was her father in jail? Was he just working a lot and they didn't get along? Was he dead? A song came over the speakers that filled the silence in the car. Stephanie began to cry. Matt pulled the car over. "Stephanie, why do you cry?" The love was apparent in his voice and the poetic innuendo. She looked at him through cataracts of tears. Then she clung to him and wept. Suddenly, he felt her sadness. It was intense. Matt had never known a stronger empathetic pain. He could feel it deeply. They cried together for a long while, where emotion took the place of time. His shoulder was wet with her tears. He took her face in his hands and kissed her. They shared a long gaze, and then she spoke to him, right there, pulled over on the side of the road. She poured out her darkest secrets and the source of the pain that they shared. "My father is staying in the city for a while," she started with a sob. "He has a secretary that he was quite fond of," she continued with a hint of subdued anger. "He kept working later and later until my mother figured it out," she said with a sarcastic tone. He looked at her with sympathetic eyes. "That's not all," she went on with a renewed sense of anger and energy. "I've never told anyone this, and I don't want you to either. I need to trust you, Matt," she pleaded. Stephanie's eyes gouged into him, looking for faith in his face. Matt had no idea what she was to say, and what she would say would change everything. He looked at her, not yet realizing the depth of pain that she endured. There were catacombs of pain hidden beneath her subconscious. It was a dark place that she had kept hidden deep within her identity, and seldom thought about on a conscious level. What she was about to reveal to Matt was something that was ultimately destructive to a young woman, something that tortured the soul of a girl so young, an incident that was the unraveling to the very existence of a young woman. "When I was 15, my father raped me," she said flat out. She took note of the strange mix of anger and unending compassion on the face of her 17-year-old boyfriend. "He was drunk," she said, with tears crushing her voice into a squeak. "I don't know if he knows what he was even doing. He told me not to tell anyone, and I never did." She fell into his lap, with tears pouring out of her eyes, finally letting out the feelings and emotions that lay buried deep inside her soul for all of the past year and a half. She had to deal with the fact that she lost her sacred innocence to the man that meant the world to her, but in some disgusting way, it burned at her soul. It was unnatural and wrong. This is something that is understood deep in the fabric of human nature. As she lay weeping in his lap, he lifted his face to hers and looked deep into her eyes, as though he were peeking through the window of her soul. "Stephanie," he said, with a new edge of determination to his voice. "I love you, and I promise everything will be okay." She looked at him and collapsed, surrendering herself into his arms. "I love you too," she said, holding back her tears. Just enough time to squeak out the words. That was the best day of my life, he thought, now laying in his bedroom. Soon after that day, on the side of the road with Stephanie, the thought of her pain became a consuming fire in Matt's soul. He decided that he would avenge her pain and serve justice to her father. Against the will of Stephanie, Matt secretly went over to her house to confront her mother about the situation. Stephanie had recently started a job as a waitress at the mom-and-pop local diner and had to work until close that night. Her mother welcomed him in. He had been over every day that summer, and now that the summer was drawing to a close, he had all but become part of the family. Mrs. Morris was a wonderful woman. She was very religious and spiritual. Not once did a conversation end without her throwing in some type of Bible quote. Though she found her husband was cheating on her, she would not give up on the marriage. Matt found this very admirable. He could only hope that Stephanie would grow up to be such a wonderful woman. "Hey, Mrs. Morris," he said as he walked in and gently closed the door behind him. "There were some things I wanted to talk to you about."
Stephanie ain't pregnant, is she?
Her mother said, with concern on her face. Matt laughed, nervously. No, she isn't, he said. You know the Bible says no sex before marriage, right? Mrs. Morris, he said, ready to get to the point, as she began to walk towards the kitchen. I know about Mr. Morris. She didn't turn, but there was a stutter in her walk that let Matt know how the words came as a surprise to her. Well, I figured Steph would tell you sooner or later, she said as she opened the refrigerator. I know it's none of my business, but there's more that you need to know. Her eyes met his and seemed to be looking at him with a force that seemed to move him backwards a step. Have you seen him driving around with her? No, he said. That's not it. Then what is it? She demanded, not removing her forceful stare. He hurt Steph, he said hesitantly to her. What? She said in disbelief. Yeah. It was all he could say. What do you mean, Matt? She asked, as if he were about to reveal to her her worst nightmare. Matt felt his anger surface. He remembered the pain he had been feeling the past few weeks through his empathy for Stephanie. He raped her, Mrs. Morris, he said with a confronting look. She told me a few weeks ago, and I've been battling with it for some time, deciding what I should do, and I thought I should tell you. She continued to stare, but her look had changed to one of disgust. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared. He could sense her anger. She began to cry angrily, and almost at that second, yelling for him to leave the house. Get out! She screamed, with the anger and the tears shaping her voice. He left, feeling helpless. What have I done? He thought. There was nothing he could do but go home and wait for Stephanie to call. The hours passed, slowly. Finally, the phone vibrated. Stephanie's face showed on the screen smiling. He suddenly was fearful. Hello? He said with a shaky voice. Matt? There was an angry whisper on the other end. He guessed it was Stephanie's. He also guessed she was hiding the fact of the phone call from her mother. I told you not to tell anyone. I trusted you. My mom is going through enough. I had to do something, he screamed into the phone, his emotions finally cutting through. It was eating me up inside. I don't want to ever talk to you again, Stephanie said. He called back and was sent immediately to voicemail. Again, and again, and again. A sleepless night followed. The next morning, he called again. Stephanie's mom answered, apologized about her reaction. She doesn't want to talk, sweetheart. I'm sorry, her mother stated firmly, but with a mothering tone in her voice. Matt remembered the 2 weeks at the end of that summer he went without talking to Stephanie. It was a life sentence. He thought he would die without seeing the one he loved so much. His heart was broken. Matt remembered a journal entry he had written during those 2 long weeks. He walked over to his old closet and dug through some boxes until he found the old blue Mead notebook that he had used for a diary when he was a teen. He flipped through. He found the entry. July 24th, 2040. I tried calling Steph's again. I think I will die if I don't see her ever again. I wonder if she thinks of me. I can't sleep. I love her so much. Can't she see that is why I told her mother? I don't want her father coming home ever, or I will kill him. I hate that man. He should be killed or raped himself. I hate him. I can't say it enough. I can't bear this. I'm going over there right now. A smile came over Matt's face as he remembered. That was the night he ran to her house. He climbed up the gutter to her window. He knocked. There was no answer. He banged harder. He saw the face of his angel come to her window. She opened it, and in the soft, angry whisper Matt loved, she scolded him for his acrobatics. "Matt, what the hell are you doing? You're gonna fall off the fucking roof, you idiot." The sound of her voice elated him, even though she yelled under her breath. In tears, he began pouring his heart out to her. And the confident boy that asked her out in the lunchroom now became openly vulnerable, lost without her love. She began to cry. She clumsily pulled him through the window as they fell on the bed. "I'm so sorry," Matt wept. "I'm sorry." He broke down. Just as he had done for her, she held his tear-filled, frowning face and whispered, with her lips touching his, "I love you. Everything's gonna be okay." His eyes met hers, and they kissed. It was a deep kiss, a kiss that moves the heart and soul in line with one another. She turned. The embrace. She was now on top of him. They were not aware of anything else. They were somewhere else. A place where only souls ignited by passion go. A natural instinct caused them to remove each other's clothes as they embraced in a new way. A way more transcendent, bigger, and deeper than kissing had been. Something both of them was doing intentionally for the first time. They made love. Getting lost in each other's hearts and feeling the actual touch of the other's soul. It was the most magical moment of Matt's young life. No, that was the best day of my life, Matt thought with a smile. Matt walked over and sat on the couch in his room at his parents' house. He looked at the clock and saw that it was 12:22 a.m. He hadn't left the house in 6 months. He continuously contemplated his time in the World Police Force, the mission that led him to his chest wounds, and the girl who changed his life forever. 6 months he had spent searching for the answers, never finding one that would stick, except for one. To move on and leave it all behind. But he wasn't ready for that quite yet. There was one thing he wanted to do. Drive. He hadn't even thought about driving his old car for a long time. Listening to the system in that old car and driving around all night used to be his favorite thing to do when he was 19. Where was that old audio player, he wondered. He walked over to his desk and found the keys in the drawer, where he put them, years ago. Years, he thought. And so much had changed. But at the same time, nothing had. He quietly walked into the hallway and down the steps to the front door. He walked outside and smelled the night summer air. He quickly walked over to his car, pushed the automatic unlock button, and heard the popping sound of the lock. He felt free. I hope it starts, he thought, as he got in. He opened up the door, never more ready for a night drive in his life. The relationship between law enforcement and protesters had become strained. Jamie didn't think it was a good idea to tempt fate. He believed that many of the problems that faced the country could be solved by developing relationships and through diplomacy. After all, each party in the conflict was only just doing their job. And so, Jamie set out to do his tonight. He would make sure his voice would be heard on the picket line. Protest was the right of every American citizen. Peaceful protest. Jamie set out to exercise his right to be heard, his right to direct the social conversation in his country. They were protesting industrial development on the edge of Jackson Hole. This threatened to endanger protected state park land and brought in industry, negatively impacting the wildlife here. The government, in an attempt to address the debt issue, was practically giving away previously federally protected lands to the highest bidder. The park community couldn't stand for it. The any way we can make a buck attitude of the government had to be stopped. Tonight, they would make their attempt. There were hundreds of people protesting, for the most part, peacefully. Jamie screamed with his brothers and sisters. No pipelines, no tar sands, no destruction of our lands. No pipelines, no tar sands, no destruction of our lands. The police held the line against the protesters. The protest was organized at the site of a recent clearing, making way for an administration building. Jamie held up his sign in solidarity. It read, "Pollution and exploitation will not be solved by corporations." They had to be winning hearts and changing minds. How could you not side with their argument? Hadn't the government screwed up enough? And now they were selling acres and acres of national parks for pennies on the dollar? Quickly, the chants became disjointed, and heads were turning towards some commotion behind the protest. Jamie watched a large yellow excavator become mobile. Its large, tank-like tires began rolling towards the newly raised building frame. As it became clear that someone had commandeered the excavator and the building frame was its target, the crowd began cheering. Jamie looked on, incredulous at what he was seeing. They're going to take down the building. Jamie continued to stare in disbelief. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Turning his head, he began to see armed and armored soldiers appear out of nowhere. They surrounded the truck. Is this a WPF security force? The rest of the crowd began to understand what was happening. There was a commotion in the crowd as everyone nervously looked on. The soldiers had their military-grade rifles aimed at the cap of the excavator. He had heard rumors about things like this, whispers from some of his more radical counterparts. Maybe he had just witnessed the beginning of the next whisper. Anymore, there was hardly a distinction between police and the military. There was a moment where the protester who was in control of the excavator could have surrendered. The moment passed, and the machine began to move forward. There were a few popping sounds, like fireworks in the distance. The crowd began to disperse. People were running for their lives. Jamie watched as the soldier threw the body from the machine, the excavator, crashing into the building frame. The soldier stopped the machine before much damage was done. Jamie felt the most intense fear he had ever felt in his life. He could be next. Jamie turned and ran faster than he ever had in his life. Stay tuned next week for Chapter 2, Drive. This has been a presentation of the audio novel, The Landscape of a Heart. Copyright 2020 by R.P. Watts.